What's up, yo? My name is Aran, and I'm here with a video review. Hey, everybody, I'm Aran, and I'm here with a video review of the Specialized 2024 Epic World Cup. What we have here is a modern example of a cross-country race bike. The use case for this varies pretty widely depending on who you are, but when you look at this bike, you should see a cross-country race bike and think that you can ride it like you would a comparable cross-country race bike. The way I have it built up here with Roval Control SL wheels, XTR shifting and braking, a Race-Face Transfer SL dropper post, light carbon cockpit from a variety of different brands. My build comes in at 9.7 kilograms. That's with pedals and cages. That's with pretty lightweight tires. It's an S-Works Fast Track 2.4 in the front, S-Works Renegade 2.4 in the rear. I would probably up that to a Renegade with a control casing in the rear, and I think that would be would make this overall a totally appropriate example of a XC race bike. And again, you can do that right around 9.7 to 9.5 kilograms on this frame or on any other top-of-the-line XC race bike today. This frame in particular, this is a size large in a pretty heavy paint scheme. I weighed it at 1,950 grams. That includes the shock mounted, seat post collar, rear axle, and UDH hanger. That's what I would call a complete frame. So that's 1950, size large. That's pretty good. Not the lightest, not the heaviest. You won't be adding any weight for a remote lockout for the rear because that's not an option with the shock. So pretty good weight, pretty compelling design. Up to you if you like it. I like it. Let's get on to the ride experience. How would I categorize what it's like to ride this bike? It's pretty simple. It's a story of stability. It's not the first time I've rode a brain fork, and it's notable this is a 2024 with a brain fork. I believe the 2025 comes with a 3-position lockout, so you lose that brain damper. But I think the brain fork is an excellent fork for this bike, and it pairs really well with the rear shock. I would describe the rear shock. The rear shock has an adjustable negative air volume. So negative air volume is something that was added to shocks to make them more supple off the top. So you may have felt a shock with no negative air volume and it doesn't want to move at all from top out, and it'll spring back quite violently to top out. It might be after pumping up your suspension, and eventually you get to that transfer point and you fill your negative air volume. So you have a little bit of air in a negative air volume, in a negative air spring, and a lot of air at a and you have a lot of air in your positive air spring That positive air spring is what you're used to pushing against when you are riding your bike down the hill. So that negative air volume is something you can tweak on a traditional shock, and I actually had a 2021 Orbea Hoist with a couple of negative air volume spacers in it, to the point where there was almost no negative air volume in that shock. And essentially you could create what this shock is doing on your bike. Every time you'd want to adjust it, you'd have to open up the can. You'd probably go through a lot of float fluid, opening the can and removing it from the bike, and putting a spacer in and out. So you would never do that, but this is a sensation that you could feel on a normal bike. I will say that while the rear provides a lot of rigid support from that adjustment of negative air volume, so it can really feel like a shelf, and it can feel like a rigid bike with no negative air volume in there. And then there's suspension behind that once you hit something hard enough. Once you get that to move, the suspension is still there. The positive air volume is still there, just like normal. On the front, it's a little bit different. You have a brain in the damper. So that's a inertia-based system where the system stays closed and supportive until it hits a bump coming up from the bottom where it opens. You can overpower it and push through the top super hard and get it to open, but generally the top is going to feel really supportive if you're just pedaling along and you have your weight on the bars, with it distributed between your feet, your hands, and so if you're just cruising along with a normal amount of weight on your hands, you're going to feel support coming up from the suspension. If you just push a little bit with your hands, you'll feel it. You have an adjustment, you can get even more support and have a harder point for that breakaway with the brain fade here. That's something you could adjust on the trail, so I'll close that up when I'm riding the road over the mountain bike trails, and then I'll open it back up and leave it open once I'm on the trails. The way I prefer to ride this bike is with the most amount of negative air in the rear shock, which is still a lot less than a normal shock, and I like to run the brain damper in the softest setting. Even in those settings, this bike is the most supportive and stable cross-country bike I have ever ridden. If you have ever dabbled on a rigid mountain bike and felt those moments where the stability of the bike allowed you to do things that you couldn't do on a bike with suspension, whether that's doing some sort of stall maneuver in a technical climb, or doing a little trials-like maneuver, or just feeling in control when normally suspension would be bucking and maybe diving into holes. This can provide that level of stability and support. It's so much fun to ride on smooth trails and push into turns, bermed or flat, doesn't matter. It's really, really an engaging bike to ride. That being said, it's not the best to ride slow, and similar to a rigid or a hardtail, you have to ride it quite actively, and you'll be rewarded if you can engage with the bike and put your energy into it. That certainly comes from the brain fork. If you are not keeping that fork loaded, it's going to feel terrible. So if you're someone who kind of rides around with their arms more or less just locked out when you're cruising on a semi-flat trail, you may have a kind of harsh ride on this bike. So yeah, the riding experience is extremely supportive. I think it's extremely capable from that stability and support. I've rode it down some crazy trails, and for what I'd call an XC race bike, it's totally there. It's awesome. In that regard, the capability is really good, well above category. I think its only limitation is the 32 millimeter chassis on the SID fork. So I think the 32 SID is a pretty good 32 millimeter fork, but I think the 32 mil forks are just so far behind the 35s. So if there was, this with a SID 35 would be almost terrifying. What you could do with the front end, I don't think the back end could maybe handle it. But yeah, I think as it's built right now, it's limited by the fork, but it's, completely in category for an XC race bike. I do think the geo and stability would allow you to ride well above category in terms of descending. And man, of course, it's a hoot to climb. But what's it like to live with? So I talked a lot in the riding experience about the different settings in the shock and how those different negative air volumes are basically achieved in a normal shock, how you would achieve that with volume spacers. So, the rear shock, you have to set that. You can just leave it. For me, it's fine. I just leave it in the, mostly open setting in the rear, almost the most negative air volume, and it's just good to go. If you were going to tweak that, you'd need to pump up the shock and possibly deflate it, pump it back up. Not too big of a deal. In regards to the rest of the bike, it's pretty straightforward. It's got headset cable routing. That sucks. It is what it is. But it's worse. It's got a knock block type thingy. I torqued that up to the torque setting they asked for. I torqued the stem up to the torque setting they asked for, 4 Newton meters on both. Guess my stem was on tighter because I still put my controls into the top tube. So I haven't experienced the knock block, certainly not a lightweight one that's done much to protect the top tube. That being said, you just live with it. So yeah, overall it's a pretty straightforward bike to live with. It does have a 55 millimeter chain line, so that's becoming much more common. No problems if you're interested in SRAM. All of their transmission offerings are 55 mil chain line, and you can find 55 mil chain line stuff for the old stuff, no problem. In fact, pretty cheap. For Shimano, pretty easy, but I wanted a 55 mil chain line XTR crankset, and that was a little challenging, but in the end I was able to snag that. So yeah, the only headaches are probably the headset cable routing, the 55 mil chain line. I don't think the shock will bring any sort of headaches into your life. The fork has a brain damper in there. I don't know. Are you really going to own this bike long enough that you actually have to work on that damper? I don't think so, unless it's a warranty issue. And if you are going to keep it that long and ride it that much, then yeah, just pay for a third-party company that specializes in bringing work to service it. The air side, the lowers, that's all super simple stuff. That's all super standard. So, like, it's a damper that your local shop probably isn't opening up anyway. And, yeah, the air can should be no problem. Um, famous last words, but, what is it? Anyway, it's a great bike. I would definitely check it out. Specialized has been kind of getting rid of them. I think it's a pretty specific bike, but I think if it's the kind of go fast bike that you're looking for, it's a phenomenal bike to own. You tune in how you like the suspension over time, and then you just kind of keep it there. It's been awesome as my daily driver, and I can't wait to ride it for the rest of 2025. Peace out.